defining yourself primarily in terms of the political spectrum is always going to lead you into convolutions and confusions that you really, as a Christian, don't need to have, because you don't owe a primary allegiance to political affiliations or movements or figures in the same way that you do to the Holy Trinity.
You are listening to the Gird Up Podcast, an unapologetically Lutheran voice for the ordinary Christian. My name is Charlie Ungemach, and I'm very glad that you are here. Today we've got a conversation with Pastor Adam Koontz, and I'm going to tell you what he's talking about in just a minute, because I'm not really sure how to summarize it myself, but I very much enjoyed the conversation, and I'm excited to share it with you. Before we do that, though, I would like to invite you to help support the work that we do here at Gird Up as we flood the internet with confessional content and prepare the people of God for whatever lies ahead. One way you can do that is by making a $5 cup of coffee donation. We call it a cup of coffee because for just $5, the price of your fancy Starbucks coffee, you can help us do what we do. Frankly, often the operational costs of this podcast are paid for by those $5 donations that individuals make. So thank you to those of you who are doing so already. Others choose to sponsor the show. If you'd like to sponsor the show, I would love to talk about you here on a podcast, or you can do it silently. That's up to you. But your support is what makes this show possible. It will be even more important as we go into the future here, because in just a couple of months, I will be going back to Wisconsin and back to Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary to finish up my schooling. I'll be writing a thesis paper and sitting in class again, and I'll be going back to work at Truth and Love Ministries. It's a great place to learn about sharing the gospel with people generally, but specifically with members of the LDS. I still plan to create content as much as I have time for, and if you'd like to help me free up some time to create even more content, you can do that by supporting the show. So please do consider doing so. Thank you to those of you already who do. And man, no matter what, I'm just flattered by the fact that I get to be here doing what I do, talking to people like Pastor Koontz. So please enjoy this episode. And our guest today is the Reverend Dr. Adam Koontz. Very happy to have you on the show again.
Yeah,
he
great to be
is an
back.
LCMS pastor up in Pennsylvania. He's the host of one of my favorite podcasts, The Brief History of Power, which is an excellent resource for I guess anybody who thinks deeply, who loves the Lord, especially if you're a fan of the Confessions, right?
Yeah.
But you're just trying to find your way in the world, like figure out what my place in this world is and kind of make sense of the world around us. Yeah. It's an excellent resource for that. Also, lately, it's been an excellent resource for those of you curious about Japanese heritage and history. So
that's due to my co-host, Kentucky Colonel Willie Grills. I'm not able to supply all that Japanese information that he is.
But in context, it makes sense. Yeah. It works. And,
it does. I hope so.
It's all making sense of the world that we live in and what our place is in it, which is really why I brought you on to have the conversation that we're going to have today. So I think the best way maybe to start this is simply to frame it. I'll frame what I'm thinking and seeing, and then I'll toss it over to you for reaction, and we'll see where we go from there.
Okay, sounds good.
One of the things that I've been noticing more and more, and I'm not sure if it's just myself that I'm changing and that's why I'm noticing it, or if it is something that's changing in real time. But in my work online here with Gird Up, but then also in my work as a vicar, especially with young adults and in our young adult Bible study, what I'm seeing, or what I think I'm seeing, is young Christians, young Lutherans, or maybe just confessional Christians in general, but I'm working mainly with young Lutherans, are being pulled in a number of different directions. And my read on it, at least, is that the political left has kind of rediscovered the reality that the best way to win Christians over to your side is to appeal to their morality. So what they've essentially started to do, in effect, is like point at our WWJD bracelets and say, I thought you were supposed to be all about love. I thought Jesus was about, uplifting the oppressed and so forth, right?
Yeah, okay.
And then you have on the other side, you've got this political right that just kind of assumes like, hey, if you're a Christian, if you profess Jesus, you'll just fall in line with us because we are the Christians. And then even calling into question, like if you don't just walk in step with us, are you really a Christian at all?
Yeah.
And then there's a third dynamic kind of involved, and this is just my read on things, that you have kind of, whether it's the older crowd, I think it is the older crowd, but you have kind of the folks that are stuck in the middle also, who they're when it comes to their, whether or not they're like, whatever their political leanings might be, in practicality, it's kind of a live and let live. Everybody's doing their best. Most people are generally good, which is a sentiment I'm not sure I'm really seeing in the younger generation.
No.
And all three of these
No.
groups of people are tugging on the heartstrings of young Christians, and young Christians are just trying to figure out what's the best way to live in this world as a lover of Jesus who's just trying to walk in the way. So I'll start there and just toss it to you. What do you think? Am I seeing it right? Is this a reality? How did we get here?
Yeah. I mean, to start with is where the notion of a political spectrum comes from, because one of the benefits of history is once you realize that it wasn't always a certain way, you can also begin to realize that it doesn't therefore have to be that way in your own life, in your own time. So the notion of a political spectrum really comes out of different alignments about how to move forward in the French Revolution within the group of people who were revolutionaries. And so the idea of a spectrum assumes you have something in common and things are progressing, and then you have different attitudes toward that progress. That is, things are moving and you have different attitudes toward that movement. You might call it progress in some kind of positive way or not, but they're moving in the way that the revolution was moving in, whom it identified as an enemy or how it prosecuted wars against other governments. And you have different attitudes toward essentially the speed of that. That's really where we start to get the notion of people being conservative. You're holding on to something that assumes movement and change. And the problem there for a Christian, just to start with, is that the things that are binding on him morally do not have to do, especially in the political, anything that would have political application, hardly ever with movement or change. Abortion was illegal everywhere in the United States in 1950. Then it was legal everywhere in the United States for a long time, and now it's illegal some places and legal other places. But a Christian's understanding of whether it's okay to take an innocent life has never changed. So the difficulty here is that a spectrum moves around, and therefore defining yourself primarily, okay, you can define yourself somewhere else down the line, but primarily in terms of the political spectrum is always going to lead you into convolutions and confusions that you really, as a Christian, don't need to have, because you don't owe a primary allegiance to political affiliations or movements or figures in the same way that you do to the Holy Trinity. Right. So it doesn't mean that you can't vote, you can't work in politics. It simply means that stuff gets ranked lower down, and because of that, things that are lower down, like I could say, well, it's non-negotiable that I'm an adult. I need to learn how to walk. If I can walk, okay, but it's negotiable if I need to run marathons. And it's fine if some people do run marathons, but not everyone has to. Like, you could be healthy and never run a marathon. You could be fine. So when you start to think primarily in terms of something that doesn't have its origin in divine revelation, you're going to end up, I think, kind of tying yourself in knots. Whatever, because I think especially because some of this is based on one's personality and one's life experiences. Okay, so some of this has been psychologically substantiated that if you have a very strong disgust reflex, you are not probably going to be on any political left in any country. Okay, if you have a very high openness to new experience, you are much more likely to be on the political left. I personally have both a strong disgust reflex psychologically and a very high openness to new ideas and experiences. So, what am I supposed to do? Well, as a Christian, I know what I'm supposed to do. I know what I'm supposed to think. But I don't need to owe primary allegiance to something that is to some degree just a reflection of one's own personal makeup and life experiences. And Luther talks about things like this a lot of times when he's talking about what we would now call natural science. But I think that the lesson applies to other realms of human thought and action, which is in the Genesis commentary, the Genesis lectures. Luther will talk about different scientific ideas about what we would call astronomy. And he doesn't reject everything out of hand, but he holds it in a different, let's say, lighter or easier or more relaxed way than he does matters of divine revelation. So he says, it's a matter of divine revelation that the world was created in 6 days. I can't agree with assorted church fathers who said that would be beneath the dignity of God to take 6 days to do this. So he created in 1 day, and 6 is a metaphor. No, Luther says it was 6 natural days. He doesn't hold astronomical theories about the heavenly bodies with the same total certainty. And I think that's a good way to start to think about your question. There's obviously more to say, but to start is simply to say, I don't owe the same kind of allegiance to anything or anyone else that I do to Christ and his truth. So honestly, that should take down the temperature a little bit. I want to talk about your 3 groups, but that's where I'd start.
Yeah, the turn of phrase you used that really caught my attention was that primary allegiance.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's a great. Well, one, I think you're right to put your finger there. It's probably a great starting place for this conversation too, simply because we're not going to get anywhere without acknowledging that what our primary allegiance should be, and to recognize that it doesn't really matter what else it might be.
Yeah.
If it's anything other than my Savior, everything's out of whack. That to me makes sense as to why the world then is kind of chasing down these other primary, what was the word? Oh, shoot, now I lost the phrase. Primary affiliations or
Allegiances. Yeah.
Allegiances. There we
Yeah.
go.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I think that is, in terms of the groups that you brought up, which are the left's current claims, the right's current claims, and both of those groups are interesting because they're much broader and more, I would say, radical than they were 20 years ago, for example. But also an older generation. Just to start with an older generation relative to younger Christians, I think partly because we're not sorting through the primary allegiance first, and therefore his revelation first. Okay. The differing emotional makeups and life experiences that different generations have in a country that has changed fairly radically, in the case of the United States, in the past 50 or 60 years. So 50 or 60 years ago, very few women work outside the home. You can like it, you can hate it. I'm just saying, like, that's an economic fact. So life has changed drastically. Okay. A change of that magnitude is going to shape people very differently because, grandpa grew up and his mom was always at home. And then the son grew up and his mom was sometimes at home. And the grandson is growing up and his mom works and his dad only sometimes works. I mean, life is just composed totally differently. And I think that is hard for older generations to grasp that it has changed that much because their life may not have. And it's hard for younger generations to grasp that life was radically different. And therefore, you said in your introduction, I think you're totally right. I just don't understand why any Christian believes this. People are basically good in trying to do the right thing. I don't know why any Christian ever believed that. That just seems totally out of whack with our understanding of original sin, but whatever, like, I agree with you that people do think that, like, especially from the older generation, that life is sort of, most people live in Mayberry and they're trying to do the right thing, and most problems are simply misunderstandings between well-intentioned people.
I think it also cuts back against what I would expect of older people too, right? The longer you live, the better you know people, the better you understand humanity. I would
Right.
think the better you would understand that not everybody is doing their best.
And
Not everybody is
I
trying to
think,
do what's right.
yeah, no, I think that's right, but I think that the cultural this is definitely something that a 25-year-old struggles to understand. Everybody used to watch the same stuff. Everybody used to be shaped by the same stuff. Everybody was given the same attitudes. Everybody drank Folgers or Hill Brothers coffee. Like, the world was not full of choice. It wasn't, I mean, we had more consumer choice than the Soviet Union, but we didn't have that much relative to today. And you didn't live this entirely separate, private, digital life that everybody lives now, where, like, I'm reading about whatever. I'm weird. So I'm reading about the history of New Mexico while I'm sitting in my living room, and one of my kids is reading a golden book to another kid. Like, that has nothing to do with New Mexico. So life was just extremely different, and I honestly didn't live this myself, but you have to understand that to see, like, if everyone is being trained by the same shows, then what was in those shows matters. Because what is, I think, particularly, and our oldest generation is the first generation that was raised on TV. The change in media from radio primary to TV primary is enormous, because radio still gives you distance to think. I'm not saying everyone was or everyone did, but it gives you distance and space. A visually primary medium, you either pay attention to or you turn it off. You can't just ignore it indefinitely. And if it's special, and the vast majority of American households have a TV by the late 1950s, that's what people think, regardless of their own life experience, right? Mayberry is not a place where original sin really exists. Mistakes and misunderstandings exist, but sin as a power in man leading to death, no. So
I would even push further with Mayberry and
yeah,
say Mayberry, that what is wicked and evil is
yeah,
always something from the outside being foisted upon us.
there
It's
you go.
when
Yeah,
the things from outside come here, and as
right,
long as we keep everybody else out, then those things don't come here.
right. Yeah, it's not the destructive power is not inside of us, right? In that rendering, and I think that younger generations are living with our country's, you could maybe say our civilization's experiment in saying there's no such thing as nature. We're going to do whatever we want, and we're going to see how that works out. And part of the reason that I think you see so many people, at least inquiring into traditional forms of Christianity, is because they have grown up with the consequences of that revolt, and realize that it's a fruitless revolt. Um, it was their parents and their grandparents who tried to revolt against nature and have not succeeded. And the youngest generations, generally bear the cost, because when we experiment with self-destruction, our children pay a higher toll than we do, right? Because we get to draw on whatever previous generations deposited of their wisdom and their goodness. But if we're not passing that on, and we're kind of trading on it, assuming that life will just kind of work out, younger generations are not getting any wisdom, but they are receiving the consequences of our actions.
What would you say the younger generation today didn't receive or is not receiving that they should have?
Yeah, this is going to be vague, but it's vague because it's big. And I see it in young guys where I can tell that they're thinking about a lot, young guys especially. Um, I can tell that they're thinking about a lot. I can tell they're looking into things a lot. I can tell they're doing a lot of research. But it is not surrounded by or all of that knowledge is not being processed by a basic knowledge of how to be. How do you react to things? How do you treat people? How do you talk in a respectful way? It goes beyond rules of social interaction into an inability to exist in the world with other people in real time, where they just feel uncomfortable or awkward, or kind of they're what they want to say kind of like spurts forth. It doesn't come forth easily. And a lot of life prior to everyone being engrossed in screens involved learning how to be in a room with older people, people the same age, how to address your grandpa in a different way than you talk to your younger brother, stuff like that, that governs not just social interaction, but also how you think about these different people and what they have to teach you. And then your grandpa's job was to, your grandpa, obviously your parents, but your grandparents, I think it's especially keen because it doesn't happen anymore, was going to teach you things that he had learned. And usually those were specifically practical things. Like my grandfather, I was 9 when he died, but he taught me how to whittle. He did it all the time. You're not just learning about knives and wood. When your grandpa is teaching you how to whittle, you're learning how he talks, how he thinks about people he's telling you a story about, how he processed something that happened 30 years ago in his life, stuff like that. So you're not really learning how to be, and then you can figure out from the internet that it wasn't always like this, or uh, you're watching a video of people not dressing like slobs as recently as 1995 in public and saying like, look what they took from us or whatever. But like, you don't know how to be in the world yourself. And that is comprehensive. It's very awkward. In dealing with guys like this, I mean, honestly, I usually they're being insulting. They're saying something that my grandfather would have hung up the phone on them for, but it's kind of like, I know that they don't know that this is even insulting, because none of these ways of interacting with other people have been taught to them, right? Life has become very cold, very distant. And I think their parents sincerely believe that their job was to give their kids plenty of money, quote, a good education, and things that they wanted, including obviously electronic devices, and that was the job. And that has given people just a sense of immense hollowness to life, and an inability to figure out, okay, where do I go from here, and how should I be? And I think it affects young guys more than girls, because girls can still kind of receive rewards from an educational system, from, whatever. I mean, guys really don't have a lot out there to seek that's going to be of benefit to them. It's not, we're toxic, right? There's no phrase toxic femininity running around, really. I'm sure somewhere in the internet someone's using it, but generally the phrase is toxic masculinity. So guys,
those guys get kicked out of YouTube anyway.
There you go. I think those guys, I think guys are especially at loose ends. I think that the crisis of how to be is everybody. I think guys are especially at loose ends.
I think it's true on both ends of the spectrum too. I think it's true for young men. I see it also being true in like retirement communities and nursing homes and so forth. You want to see, frankly, I'm just going to say it as boldly as I feel it. You want to see men without hope, or you want to see despondent men go somewhere where there's no young people around whatsoever. Go meet the guys in a nursing home whose bodies continue on, but their minds and hearts do not. I'm going to go visit the VA down here in a couple of days. That's what you see in the hallways.
No, I think that's
you
right.
just walk the hallways and you witness that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's right, because we really do treat age as a dysfunction, rather than a source of wisdom. And even the aged are not trying to accumulate wisdom; they're trying to accumulate comfort. And then they might obtain the comfort, but they don't obtain the sense of purpose you get from being able to transmit wisdom.
Yeah. So it's better in the church than it is in the world, generally speaking.
I think so. Yeah.
But it's not what it ought to be
No.
either.
No. And I think that the interpersonal dysfunction is general. I don't think that the church has escaped that by any means. I think it's probably the biggest source of our retention issue, that pretty much every church of any size or description has. That if part of how to be is that I am a professing Christian, especially of the specific kind that I'm raising my children to be, then that's just the way that life is, in the same way that I make faces my dad makes. Like it's just part of life, and I think that if you are distant, if there's a coldness, if there's everyone's kind of locked away in his own digital world maybe, or there's even a social dynamic of coldness on top of that. Whatever the case is, that dysfunction I see in the church as well as in the world. So you have Christians whose kids don't want to be Christian because what's the social or cultural incentive to be Christian? And you train them to want to have a really good job. So they're pursuing that, and they realize, like, it doesn't matter if I go to church in the world that you sent me into. But also, there are plenty of, and I think I was a little more plugged into this world by virtue of my education. There are plenty of left-wing professors in college towns throughout America whose sons are finding right-wing things on the internet, and they are appalled. And the reason that happens to everybody is because nobody talks to each other. Nobody's transmitting anything to each other. So you can't even rely on a kid from Berkeley, California, whose parents are both Cal professors, to be left-wing. You can't, despite how he was raised, right? Because everyone is kind of living in his own private world, and that's not all bad. Like, the amount of information available is tremendous in a way that it certainly wasn't 30 years ago. But it does mean that everyone is kind of doing his own thing. And I think that applies to the way in which, to bring it back to where you started, the way in which both left and right want to motivate people to do things, particularly to motivate Christians to do things.
Yeah. You bring to mind the statistics that we're seeing around the Catholic Church, and the fact that we have so many Catholic, especially even traditional, like true Roman Catholic influencers. I'm not sure how that happened, but we do at the moment. You hear them celebrating quite a bit this idea that there's a lot of young people seeking out Roman Catholicism. What they don't talk about, and I understand because it's not good for the brand, that they don't talk about is that the back door is just as wide open as it always has been. And I think it's important for us to be thinking about that even as non-Catholics, because it is a mirror in many ways of what we're experiencing as Lutherans as well.
Yeah. I mean, if we're bringing in people, and a lot of us are, I mean, I certainly have young men, young couples, particularly interested, and they just kind of come off the internet. I mean, you're not going to find them at a real life event, they're not there. They're on the internet until they show up at church. I think pretty much all of us have that. Anybody listening to this podcast is going to be familiar with that. They might be those guys. That to some degree is masking a retention problem that we still have, which is located, it's located in churches, but it's especially located in families, whether they go to church or not. And what their closeness is, what their sense of purpose is. And I think for most people, that's also like I'm a pastor. I love when people come to church every week. I think they should come to church every week. I also know that is not the sole component of significance, love, joy, and light found in their life. For most people, we're created to find that also in our families, not in where we get our W-2s from, but in our families. And when that part is broken in one or many ways, that affects the church But it also makes the person relatively unable to know what he thinks and why. And then it destroys any sense of like continuity over generations. And I do believe that continuity over generations is natural, generally speaking, unless something catastrophic happens to a society. The idea that I'm kind of living in the same like basic way that my great grandfather did should not be that strange. I mean, maybe I get paid for doing different work. I mean, my great grandfather Koontz was he worked on a railroad. He basically like shoveled rocks in various places on the railroad or in coal mines. Okay, I'm not doing
not
that.
a graphic designer.
Yeah, no, I don't think there were that many. There certainly were not many in Fayette County, Pennsylvania. So yeah, he wasn't doing that. I'm not doing that. But the idea that we would sort of have the same attitudes towards life or react in the same way, I think that's kind of natural. I mean, we have the same eye color and hair color. So that sense of continuity is always going to be obliterated, and that leaves people at loose ends. And then I think to bring it back to the political thing, I think that leaves them. I think that is why, above all, if there's any organic reality to this, the political spectrum has widened enormously. Really since roughly the second Bush administration. I mean, if you go back to the year 2000, and I've done at least one B-Hop episode on the Florida election debacle of 2000. Part of that was an exercise in nostalgia, but part of it was just like, you go back there, and in 2000, if somebody in my church said, "Oh, I'm a diehard Democrat, Pastor," I would have said, "Okay, what? Like you're just more into environmental legislation than this guy over here who's a Republican, and you're kind of less for wars maybe than the Republican, and you have different, whatever." Okay. Now, if you say you voted a certain way, maybe we can talk about that, but you're a diehard Democrat. So you're for transgenderism. Like, if you go back to the year 2000, it doesn't look like a recognizable place. Right. And if you said, "I'm on the right" in the year 2000, you never meant, not in the United States, you never meant, "I have significant sympathies for the Third Reich." You never meant that, because you're an American. It just wasn't part of the discussion. Okay. So why has it broadened so much? You could talk about this influencer, that influencer who has higher follower numbers on Twitter. I think that's worth talking about. But your question is kind of about how the wings affect people. I think there is organic demand now for things like democratic socialism, or you could say, I guess you could say broadly, fascism, right? It has different permutations. That spectrum has opened up organically because people are not reflecting the range of options that their great grandfather or their grandfather had. Do you know what I mean? So they're very open. They're all over the place. People are becoming East Orthodox. People are, anti-Christian, kind of Nietzschean right wingers. I mean, that exists on Twitter. I don't know how broad that really is, but again, that wasn't really a thing anyone was. I'm a right-wing Nietzschean. No, you're not. That doesn't exist. 25 years ago, right? All the Nietzscheans are left-wing, and they're tenured professors, So things have changed broadly, I think partly because we are undergoing massive rupture. And I'm not saying this like, let's just put it all back in the bottle. Like, that's not how history works. History moves and you deal with it. But I think it has broadened in the enormous way that it does because we have undergone, blame Steve Jobs if you want to, but we have undergone enormous societal and personal rupture in what we think and how we act. It's almost like a war obliterated most of us, and now there's just completely different people running around.
Yeah. So where my mind naturally goes then is, how I think this is grammatically correct. I'm not sure how to ask this question. How do I be in the world today?
Yeah. How then shall we be, I think was the Francis Schaeffer thing in the 70s, which was another, kind of aftermath of gigantic rupture. And then the 80s were kind of normal. So maybe we have normal coming up. I don't really know. The primary allegiance thing, I think, should guide you. Let me go back to the example of the Democratic Party, because to kind of answer the question a little bit more concretely. I think that you can debate whether you should register as a Democrat and advocate for this or that. You really can't debate, are you a Christian? Do you support transgenderism? You actually can't. That's not up for debate, because male and female who created them. So what you're dealing with is a situation where each Christian has to accept responsibility for himself and his beliefs, because he can't really any longer think, okay, I'm getting this from something that is culturally normal, my ex account, the Hassan Piker, whatever, and so it's fine. No, like we are beyond fine. You have to be able to evaluate, was Nietzsche's critique of Christianity okay? To evaluate certain right-wing posters. You also have to be able to evaluate, like, what does James Tallarico running in Texas mean by love? And why is he saying it's okay? Like, he's saying like, I'm a pastor and I'm cool with all this. So that, I think, means two things. One's good, one's bad. The one that's good is Christians have been and are being shaken out of not just slumber, but like stupor, where everything was, relatively speaking, spoon-fed to us. And I think that's good. But that is also, in terms of, you could think in terms of gardening, that's also a thinning process or a weeding out process. And that's unfortunate, because it is probably harder than it's ever been for a Christian not to be particularly thoughtful, not to be able to spend time thinking through all these things and yet remain a Christian. And I will lament, right? So I'm not going to lament the internet, or people are saying weird things on the internet that I may or may not disagree with. I will lament that I think it's much better to live in a society where being Christian, being a professing biblical Christian, is normal and relatively simple for the average person, right? Understanding that his enemies are always the devil, the world, and his sinful flesh. The world part needs to be as relatively minimal as possible. And I think you see this if you look at kind of the history of missions, is that often you'll get effort, relatively little fruit. And then once you get enough people adopting Christianity, then it kind of comes in a big wave. And it may be because there's a very important figure. Maybe it's a king, maybe it's a chief of some kind, whatever. Or it may be a certain number of people, as seems somewhat likely in the case of the Roman Empire. The Christians eventually, there were enough of them, they became a problem. Persecution was heightened, and then we get Constantine. But I don't want life to be extremely difficult for normal people who don't have time or inclination to like study theology, to have to think through, like, is it okay if boys turn into girls? Like, a normal person shouldn't have to have his job on the line because of something that unnatural, nor should he have to think through whether he's going to try to keep his job by affirming something, but not really, but like it kind of looks like it, so HR is satisfied. Like, this is a terrible world. I hate it for the sake of the sheep that being a Christian is becoming so abnormal. That's not good for anybody. And it will weed out lots of people they're not unbelievers, but they are relatively weak Christians. And a wind is coming and is already here that is knocking them down.
Yeah, that shift in wind then requires a change of behavior, right?
Yeah.
So what then is the role of the church in all of this? Is it the church's, to go back to the same question,
Yeah.
is it the church that should be conscious of defining what it means to be? Is it the church's responsibility to be, I mean, everything from teaching like people how to behave in the world and so
Yeah.
forth, to then giving them the filters through which they're seeing all these things? I can hear part of the reason I'm asking the question is I
Yeah.
can hear the argument, and I can even hear myself in the past saying things like the church's job is to preach the gospel,
Yeah.
and if they do that, then everything else will fall into place. Is that,
Yeah.
yeah? What is the
Okay.
church's role in all this?
Yeah. The church's role is to proclaim the divine truths of Scripture, and that's always been true. And the reason I say it that way is because I think that most Lutherans of whatever theological stripe are prone to engage in gospel reductionism. That is, that we only talk about the gospel strictly speaking, and that's the point of that's the takeaway from every single sermon. That is everything we always, only, and ever say. And I'm happy to militate against that idea. I mean, I have been savaged by people for saying what I just said, but I'm very confident that it is my job to say what is in the Scriptures, whether it is strictly speaking the gospel or not. Okay, so if that is happening, and I don't think that has been happening with application to, say, the family, or has not been happening with application to, say, the state's responsibility to uphold goodness, is that you get selective coverage. Nobody ever stops talking about the law of God in the church. You just get selective coverage. Okay, so in the Missouri Synod, at least, we get the gospel strictly speaking, and then we get endless discussion of the eighth commandment. Okay, endless discussion, which always has to do with interpersonal conflict and how it should or shouldn't be handled, or how it has been handled, or ought to have been handled, or whatever. I'm just pleading for us to talk about other things besides, in addition to, the gospel strictly speaking and the eighth commandment. That's all I'm saying. And when you do that, the Holy Spirit, which is given to each believer, will apply those truths to his life, and he will learn, for example, that it is his duty not just to say that he honors his father and his mother, but also to seek by God's grace and power to carry that out in his own particular life in a way his pastor can't tell him to do. And I can't set up a program to tell him how to do that. The Holy Spirit of God is at work through his word in each believer's soul to apply the truths of Scripture to his life. And I actually trust that. So I don't think we need an enormous number of fresh programs for every single thing that is good that isn't currently being done in large numbers. I do think that we need a wider, specific to the church, we need a wider scope to what preaching is applying the Word of God to people's lives, so that they are actually brought to a knowledge of sin and righteousness and judgment, which is the work of the Holy Spirit, according to Jesus, right? So I think when that happens, then they receive God's wisdom. And I am not, and I could in no possible universe do any of that from a pulpit. I mean, I just say what's in the Bible, and the Spirit uses his word how he will. But if I never say it, like if I never preach about time, and all my people are all worried about time. They don't have enough time. They're too busy. They feel like they've wasted their time. If I never preach any sermon about time or money or any of the things they actually think about, that's on me. That is my problem.
It's a case for the pericope for sure.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I think that I think the church will always find something to argue about. I would just rather argue about weightier things than this or that synodical initiative, because I think that I don't know about the Wisconsin Synod. In my own synod, we the volume and frequency of argument about synod and what synod should be doing and what synod isn't doing and how synod should be doing it, and how the people who don't like what synod is doing should be talking. All of that comes about, I think it's not a distraction, it's a symptom. And it's a symptom of the sense everyone has that things are somehow shrinking. And so, it's like when a marriage is falling apart, I could tell you like 2 to 3 things that I know are probably going wrong in that marriage, like almost every time. But I could never tell you the weird little stuff that they're arguing about, because that's particular to every human bond that is dissolving under some pressure.
Yeah. I I don't know for sure what the issue is in the wells that would fit into that place.
Yeah.
What I can tell you is it doesn't matter what the meeting is about. It doesn't matter what the paper that was just read was about. At some point, someone's going to stand up and say, yeah, but you can do contemporary worship right. And then also someone will make a snide comment about how the presenter is wearing a clerical collar. But to your point,
Yeah.
to your point, and I like what you just said about the marriage, right?
Yeah.
To your point is the thought process behind those snide comments that just keep coming back up again and again and again in those meetings, or those little petty arguments, is that if we could all just come to an understanding on that, then our shrinking problem goes away.
Correct. Yeah.
But it's in my mind, it's not a lot different than saying, well, you want to fix your marriage, say I love you more often. Okay, you might have said I love you more often, but what about all the behaviors, all the behaviors that led up to the I love you not being said as often, right?
Yeah, right. That's right.
So to that point, even further down the road, and I'm thinking specifically with a couple of my young adults or my young guys in mind, just shout out to Isaiah Hartzell, man. This is for you. How then, as a young, I'll say young person because that's what I've got in my mind, but as somebody who's trying to navigate all of this, especially if you're a young person in the world today who is in a minority as a Lutheran, how then do I have those how do I communicate to the people around me that I do love Jesus and I do love you, but I'm not going to affirm your sexual choices or whatever, and I'm also not going to try and explain away why the president is posting pictures of himself as Jesus, right? I'm not going either direction here. I'm not going to do either of those things, and yet I'm still a Christian.
Yeah,
and in fact, I think I'm walking the right path, and I'm not sure you are, is kind of the implication behind it, right?
Yeah, that's definitely the implication. I think that's also the assumption, certainly of the other party, if not of the Christian. I think that probably one of the best guides to this is the last time that the church was, within sort of the mainstream of church history. There are other instances, but if you go back to the church prior to its legalization in the Roman Empire, you do have some guides to how to handle these things, because it was not socially normal, and later on it became socially prestigious, and then it became the sole religion, sole legal religion of the empire. Before that time, depending on where you live, you face severe consequences. Pretty much anywhere you live, you face the burden of being weird. So it's helpful to know how they communicated, right? I think some of the American churches, you could almost say like tics, but you could certainly say habits are born from a different culture. A lot of our evangelism programs are still oriented towards a culture where people may not be practicing Christianity, but if they were practicing a religion, they would practice Christianity. And I mean, that's even still in sort of, to the extent that anyone still uses such things, evangelism scripts, where you start to ask them questions about eternity and other such things that in their kind of like um, iPhone brain fog, they've never asked themselves. Sorry, like they've never asked themselves that, and they don't even give themselves time to think. There's no digital hygiene going on there, so they don't think. They kind of receive impressions and react. Um, but the church doesn't accept the burden of I would say setting the emotional thermostat. Um, what I mean by that is you don't actually have control over whether they think you are a well-meaning, kind person. And I'm trying to use modern words because kindness, always be kind, stuff like that is still very common, even if maybe stolen from the New Testament, is very common, partly because of the poor mental health of so many Americans. So you don't have control over whether they think you're kind or thoughtful or hardly any of that. You really only have control over what you say and how you manage the dynamic once some kind of social dynamic has been established. You are on the same basketball team. You sit next to each other in class. Your cousins, whatever the dynamic is. And you have to figure out how that dynamic is going to be as friendly, as jovial as possible. And then you have to be prepared for confrontation to occur and to be as calm during a confrontation as possible. Um, that is what you can see early Christian martyrs who are facing a lot worse than you're being called to. I mean, you might be called to ostracism. You might be called to losing a relationship. You're probably not being called to physical death. When they were called to physical death, they were very calm. Um, Polycarp is so calm, he makes a joke when he's about to die, right? They demand that he says, "Away with the atheists," denouncing the Christians, and he points to the pagan crowd waiting to see his execution and says, "Away with the atheists." So if you can keep your head, that I think is a lot more valuable than trying to make sure that they know that you're nice and you're kind and everything. And you may well be like the nicest, kindest, most wonderful person anyone's ever met. You just need to assume that you don't really have control over that perception. But if they know you're a Christian, right? If they don't know you're a Christian, maybe you get a free pass for a while. But I think that you need to realize that you are headed into difficulty, potentially confrontation, potentially consequences for your faith. And that an older generation just generally will not understand that because they didn't deal with it when they were your age, and they're probably never going to have to deal with it. The closest that I've seen them come is when their own kids or grandkids turn on them. And the pain is always accompanied in that case by shock because they're like, I don't even know what happened. I don't even know what happened. And you could give them like a cheap lecture about, well, you should have done this and blah, blah, blah. And true, probably. Like things could have been done differently. No question about that. It's true for anybody. But if you don't have any empathy for their shock, like they are from a different world. They didn't think the world would change that drastically. They thought that the rules that they learned when they were 20 would apply when their kids were 20 and their grandkids were 20. So they're shocked to find they don't.
Yeah. And to flip that on its head too, I
Yeah.
think I'll speak for my own kind of the last wave of millennials, right? Was kind of where I would land. We from little on, we were constantly trained, and this isn't necessarily in church or in my family, but that we were just constantly trained that conflict is bad. Conflict is bad. We don't do conflict. Like if conflict happens, there's something wrong. Like we avoid conflict.
Yeah. Okay.
But like it's the plague. It'll make us sick. And now you're telling us that if we're Christians, we just need to expect it.
Yeah.
I don't know how to make sense of that.
Yeah, that's tough. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry about that. I mean, I'm not. I feel that I was raised in some kind of time warp and missed these things. And so I I feel fortunate in that way because I don't think that 25 years ago, 26 years ago, if you go back to the election I was referencing earlier, I don't think anyone really grasped we're going to get to a point where we are debating who's really the president of the United States. Now, if you go back 26 years ago, there were Democrats. I know it. I've watched the videos. I've read the books saying George W. Bush is not the legitimate president of the United States of America. That's not actually a new thing. Okay. Trump didn't start anything like that. Biden didn't start that. What has changed is the way in which people are expected in their daily lives, moment by moment, to be engrossed in politics and also to say the right thing politically at all times. And that is a pressurization of daily life and everyone's attention that didn't exist. Life was easier to get through. So conflict was also easier to avoid, but life was easier to get through, right? And I remember the first time I encountered these things because of my not having grown up Christian and then going to very liberal, very left wing, let's say, would it be a better term, educational environments, and being expected. This is like 20 plus years ago, not 25, but 20 plus. Being expected to kind of say the right thing, kind of in the same way that most people did, like as of 2020. And so you go through the fight or flight moment that a lot of people did 5 or 6 years ago now, just a little bit earlier than others, but it's the same dynamic. Like, do I hate myself? Am I sorry that I'm a white male who likes girls? Like all of these kinds of things. And I don't think older generations understand that that's happening to kids in like middle school and high school now, And so I don't think anyone who's under a certain age is going to be surprised that I'm saying conflict is just going to happen. I think it's maybe my age and up who are surprised that conflict is unavoidable, right? And they almost talk about, and I see this even with people who are like, well, let the persecution come or something. It's like, I don't think you understand what that's like. Even on a daily kind of eating away at you level, it's miserable to constantly be in conflict with the environment around you. You don't want actual legal or physical persecution. Like that is going to, again, from a pastoral perspective, I don't want normal people whose faith is okay, but not extremely strong or something, to have to constantly be under pressure for being a Christian, because I know what will happen. Most will fall away, and I don't want that. I don't know why anybody would want that, right? But an environment in which conflict is just coming to you, you're not seeking it out, is always going to be a hard one. It does make people stronger who go through those things, but for the general well-being of most of the church, it decimates it. It's very hard to get through, right? I mean, we just did this with COVID, and that wasn't even, in the vast majority of cases in the United States, any kind of direct persecution. That was disagreement about what was being required of us that decimated churches. So I don't want more of that, let alone direct persecution. Yeah.
Yeah. To make that a positive, what
Yeah.
a blessing it is that we have so many young people, one, who are seeking us out, and two, who
Yeah.
are actively arming themselves
Tremendous.
for these conflicts that are coming.
Tremendous. And I mean, it's like you're a better person at 20 than I was. You're a better person at 25 than I was when I was 25. I mean, I have no problem saying that. I can remember. So, and I'm an undisclosed age, but I'm not 25. I might be 75, but I'm definitely not 25. And I think that it's, if an older generation doesn't have a love for a younger generation, that's also unnatural. It's unnatural not to have continuity with people who came before you. It's also unnatural to despise people who come after you. So I think that, love is the bond of perfection here. If that doesn't exist, particularly in the church and in families, we don't have much of a shot. I think if there is love and concern, then, we could get through things stronger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess if we're going to summarize here,
Yeah.
Your primary allegiance is to Christ. Understand that there's going to be waves and winds beating against you as you hold firmly to Christ.
Yeah.
And then lean into the blessings that are around us, particularly that have to do with Christ and his church. And look for opportunities to be doing things like crossing generations and speaking meaningfully into the problems that we see other people experiencing too. Is there anywhere else that you'd like to go on that as a wrap up?
Yeah, I think that all of these things will help us learn why on the night in which he was betrayed, as he's looking at departing from the disciples and going to his Father, the Lord says specifically and teaches specifically, love one another. And that he says that because he knows how difficult that will be.
And then gives us the very means by which it's made possible.
Yeah. Yep.
Awesome. Well, Pastor Koontz, thanks for being on the show
Yeah,
again.
thank
it's a
you.
pleasure to have you.
Yeah, my pleasure as always.
And God bless the work you're doing out in Pennsylvania. You mentioned last time that you're working on a book. How's that going?
Yeah. There's kind of two at one time. One is the kind of lay level family Bible commentary from Ed Crucham, and that's that I'm working on the Old Testament histories this year. So that's working on that. That's always a lot of fun, but it's essentially like the kind of summary I would give in Bible class of any given chapter of Scripture with some notes of illustration and application. So that's Family Bible Commentary volume. It's volume 2, but it's the 4th one that I will have published. The other book is in the Confessional Lutheran Dogmatics series, and that's on creation. So that's a longer term project. That's a scholarly project. It's a whole different part of my brain, and I say as a repentant exegete that I love doing systematic theology because it's so enormous and comprehensive and delightful to work on. So, so I'm working on that. That's not coming out this year, but that's very enjoyable.
All right. Awesome. Yeah. Exciting things to come.
Yeah.
If you want to be part of the Gird Up mission, you're in the right place. Hit follow, subscribe, leave a rating and review, and share this episode with someone who needs a community like this. If you'd like to support the work we do here at Gird Up, consider a cup of coffee donation. Go to www.girdupministries.com, select buy us a cup of coffee, and help us flood the internet with confessional content. If you'd like to sponsor, reach out to me directly. And if you've got questions, topics, or guest ideas, send them my way through the link in the show notes. Thanks again to Pastor Koontz. Go listen to The Brief History of Power. And I love you guys. God bless you. And I can't wait to talk to you again next week.